evening. My name is Emily Schutenberg, and I am piano faculty and coordinator of community music here. And you are in for a wonderful treat tonight listening to the band. But before we get started, a couple pointers, of course, please turn off your devices. This includes the screen, even if you're playing a game on silent. I sat in the back at a concert recently, and it was still quite distracting to see people's screens on, so please keep that in mind. You're welcome to take photographs. If you move around, please do so in between numbers. And I want to point out one upcoming event. So if you enjoyed this one, you have an opportunity to come and sit in this hall one more time. Sophomore graduating student, Mackenzie Puckett, is performing a solo tuba recital this coming Thursday. You'll be late, and it is free and open to everyone, so please come out and support her in that special performance. I think that is everything I have to say, so I really hope you enjoyed tonight's concert, and if you want to play in this group, I know it doesn't look like it, but there is room. You are welcome to dust off your instruments and come join us. So now I would like to welcome Mr. Joshua Stevenson.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our concert this evening. That first selection that we played for you was called Main Street Celebration. It was by Reineke. It was commissioned by his own high school alma mater, the Tippecanoe High School in Tip City, Ohio, and it depicts fond memories of growing up in this small town just north of Dayton, Ohio. The composer states that he vividly remembers playing hide and seek with his friends in the cornfield when he was on his way to the Friday night football games. The piece is like a celebration of small town ideals that are learned on main streets across America. Our next selection is a march by Karl King. Karl King is also an Ohio native, and he was self-taught composer. He got his musical start in the circus bands. There he began writing circus marches, and he's amassed more than 300 works. He spent the bulk of his career in Fort Dodge, Iowa, where he conducted what would become the Karl King Band. Lexington March is a carousel march, and it opens with a crisp trumpet fanfare and has lots of great melodic material throughout. We hope you enjoy Lexington March. We hope you enjoy A Time to Dance. composition that is intended to contain the flavor of Irish, Celtic, folk music. Although none of the material is based on any kind of folk songs, there are iconic characteristics of folk music of Ireland within the piece. The term Bardic is defined as a person of Celtic origin who composed and recited epic or heroic poems, often while playing the harp. A reel is a lively Irish or Scottish folk dance. Reels are in duple meter and are different from the triple meter of a typical Irish jig. We hope you enjoy Bardic air and reel. piece was written in 1972, and the first performance took place on April 7th, 1972. The music is in sectional form, opening with a broad introduction that states all of the thematic material from which the work is built. It's followed by a brilliant allegro, commencing with a fanfare-like figure in the brass and proceeding through a hard-driving development that finally dies away as the third section begins. This contrasting episode is built from a long lyrical line played by all the flutes, and the closing section leads back to an allegro that ends with a joyous and triumphant conclusion. We hope you enjoy Imperatrix. It's loosely adapted from Gregory Maguire's 1995 novel Wicked, The Life and Times of the Wicked Witch of the West. The musical is told from the perspective of two witches, Elphaba and Glenda, before and after Dorothy's arrival in Oz. The story explores the complex friendship between them, their contrasting personalities, and their conflicting viewpoints. The original Broadway production won 3 Tony Awards, and the original cast album received a Grammy. The success of the Broadway production has spawned many productions worldwide, including the recent 2024 box office movie. In our next arrangement, you're going to hear several selections from the Broadway musical No One Mourns the Wicked, I'm Not That Girl, Defying Gravity, No Good Deed, and For Good. We hope you enjoy highlights from Wicked. Duluth, Minnesota, one of the most is on the westernmost shore of the Lake Superior. Wow, really pushing that. The city of Duluth is on the westernmost shore of Lake Superior. It's further north than most cities in the continental United States, so the title seems appropriate. Suggesting perhaps an exciting downhill ski run, or possibly a snowmobile chase through the woods, Due North is a fast-paced overture composed using a single tempo. Along the way, various moves are suggested as themes and musical ideas are passed from section to section, and the percussion provides a driving rhythmic pulse throughout. We hope you enjoy Due North. attending our performance tonight. Out of all the things you could have done this evening, you chose to be with us, and we consider that an honor, and thank you for being here tonight. The film score for How to Train Your Dragon has been among the most programmed of the last decade, and it's been arranged for almost every imaginable combination of instruments. John Powell, born and bred in London, was for some years Hans Zimmer's assistant, and it was Zimmer who helped set up Powell with the film's producers. Powell's score was nominated for an Oscar and a Grammy, and its tuneful and evocative music could only be the sounds of dragons swooping through the tufted clouds of a summer sky. We hope you enjoy Sean O'Loughlin's arrangement of How to Train Your Dragon.